We're the nightcaps, nighty nightcaps, and we hail from everywhere. But we meet and greet and reminisce when we broadcast over the air.
Hi, I'm John, and welcome to my qualifying exam verbal presentation on persuasion and resistance in mediated partisan political information sources. Crawley and others have argued that talk radio was the first social media that gave ordinary citizens an opportunity to interact with opinion leaders and each other before a mass audience. National call-in talk shows have existed since the 1970s, and national partisan political talk has existed since the 1980s. Before then, the U.S. government required broadcasters to provide equal time to opposing viewpoints. But in the years since that rule has been repealed, conservative talk has come to dominate the political talk radio spectrum. Liberal talk radio has been attempted, but it hasn't proven to be financially viable. Virtually everybody knows Rush Limbaugh. His show is highly popular, politically influential, and long-running, which means a lot of scholars have had the opportunity to study it. Because that work has produced a large volume of data about Limbaugh and his audience, many examples in my own research will be related to the Limbaugh program. But while Limbaugh may be prototypical of partisan talk hosts, the questions I'm exploring should apply to similar voices in mass media, as well as those found in social media, including Twitter, blogs, internet radio, online videos, and even print. As polarization within the American body politic keeps broadening and deepening, the relationship between mass media opinion leaders and their followers is a worthy area of study by media psychology, both to understand mechanisms contributing to mediated dissemination and promotion of political ideology, as well as ways to ensure audiences are aware of the persuasion in the messages. So my question is, what attracts audiences to these programs? How does the host communicate with the audience? And how are audience members' attitudes challenged, reinforced, or modified by exposure to the hosts? One important element in the power of talk shows to persuade is the bonds audiences form with each other. Communities of listeners exist on the air, online, and sometimes even in real-world meetups. Group members are rewarded with acceptance, camaraderie, and social connectedness, which makes belonging more salient. Signs of membership appear in merchandise like bumper stickers and t-shirts, and in callers introducing themselves to each other as ditto heads or students of Limbaugh's Institute of Advanced Conservative Thought. Audience members also form parasocial relationships with the host, who gains influence with the audience due to their feelings of connectedness with him or her. This makes the host a valued source of opinions and information, and he or she rewards the audience by reducing complexity in news and politics and orients the audience to the community's preferred values and norms. In other words, the host becomes an opinion shaper for a community primed by selection bias, which suggests that people choose shows and hosts that reflect their own opinions. The host is a friend who tells listeners what they want to hear. I mentioned earlier that political talk in the United States is primarily conservative. One explanation for that is because many conservatives believe the so-called mainstream media is liberally biased. They say liberals don't need liberal talk shows on the radio because newspapers, TV, and public radio fill that side's information needs. But conservatives need information sources without the liberal slant. So listeners come to Limbaugh and similar shows looking for views they agree with, and they find a community of fellow believers whose attitudes are endorsed and validated and further shaped by the host. In the case of conservative radio, those beliefs are based on a political frame that says their rights, freedoms, and traditions are under siege by political rivals. And so the listener community becomes an in-group based on the common threat and centered around the host. Listeners show up feeling oppressed and are reinforced with validation and information about who to blame for it. Social identity theory says that group members seek to maximize self-esteem through attending to information validating the group, as well as devaluating, contrasting outgroups. Protecting the group and the individual's membership in it could thereby motivate the individual to confirm and strengthen his or her agreement with group norms and attitudes, which in the case of a group constructed around partisan media sources includes greater acceptance and adherence to the beliefs expressed by the host. In the case of the Limbaugh program, this has been demonstrated by what Barker and Knight call hostility toward those items beyond what can be accounted for by ideology, party identification, exposure to other conservative messages, affect for Limbaugh, attitudes that reflect Limbaugh's message, and opinion change toward greater conservatism and antipathy toward Limbaugh's favorite targets. This phenomena creates a group made up of radio listeners with a shared political perspective, built around a personality who reinforces their opinions, explains the world to them in their preferred frame, and provides validation for their feelings of conflict and threat represented by an outgroup. In politics, that's a partial description of populism, and in fact, Kramer introduces media populism as an equivalent existing in mass communications. And in an ironic twist, Limbaugh essentially describes himself as a media populist in the very attempt to deny it. Here are his words from 1994. Despite claims from my detractors that my audience is comprised of mind-numbed robots waiting for me to give them some sort of marching orders, the fact is that I am merely enunciating opinions and analysis that support what they already know. Thousands of listeners have told me on the air, in faxes, letters, and by computer email that I agree with them. Finally, they say, somebody in the media is saying out loud what they have believed all along. An eager, homogeneous audience, a charismatic leader, and a national, if not global, communications channel comprising radio stations, websites, blogs, streaming audio, and even video webcasts of radio shows. That's a solid foundation for influence. And it's not just Limbaugh who has it. The same channels are used by Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, Michael Savage, and many others. Liberal voices like Rachel Maddow may have these resources too, but the literature does not address whether liberal audiences attend to programs and receive the same gratifications as conservative listeners do. For that reason alone, the majority of research into persuasive appeals in talk shows also focuses on conservative messages. So what techniques of persuasion do hosts employ to influence their audience? Let's start with entertainment education. Moyer Gusset defines entertainment education content as pro-social messages that are embedded into popular entertainment media content. Entertainment education obtains its power by its appearance as entertainment rather than argument. People accept ideas they hear in entertainment more regularly than in obvious attempts to persuade them. Limbaugh's program often features songs, parodies, and comedic elements, which his supporters dismiss as mere showmanship. It could be that a song about Barack the Magic Negro avoids the reactance against its premise that would result from the host presenting the same ideas in a spoken argument.
Barack the Magic Negro lives in D.C. The LA Times, they call him that cause he's not authentic like me. Yeah, the guy from the
Moving away from Limbaugh for a moment, Norton describes how Bill O'Reilly presents himself as a common man dedicated to revealing truth, who grew from blue-collar and Catholic roots to confront bullies, enemies, and distortion. Now he's an ordinary guy fighting for his audience. Identification leads subjects to take on the role of a character in narrative, in this case the show's host. Dori Hatchwin points out that these callers are used strategically to reinforce the host's statement, such as by expressing agreement, providing examples of proof, and asking the host for more information. When callers agree, the host reinforces their attitudes and membership in the show community with positive statements. According to Bandura's social cognitive theory, learning occurs when subjects observe the behavior and rewards received by similar others. Because of this, listeners seeing rewards granted to callers who represent their shared community could gain a powerful reinforcement, even the callers who never call in. Transportation may also be at work. In transportation, the audience member loses themselves in the world of a story. The monologues that form a significant portion of partisan talk media programming can be examined as narratives presented by the host. In this example, imagery of simplicity and a simpler time, described as Dick and Jane's C-Spot Run Easy, could encourage involvement in the narrative. And Limbaugh's reference to a prior caller's similar point reinforces feelings of community. If a listener is transported into this narrative, then he or she might be receptive to Limbaugh's hyperbole regarding nuking this stuff we heard last night. These elements could lull a transported listener into agreeing that violent action is necessary to upend even commentators on the right in order to defeat Hillary Clinton's campaign for president. Elements of propaganda have also been identified in talk shows. 2 studies of Bill O'Reilly's TV show have claimed to find instances of techniques including name-calling, glittering generalities, bandwagon, and plain folk appeals. Another study made similar claims about Limbaugh. But although talk show hosts may use tactics associated with propaganda, that does not necessarily make them propagandists. Swain writes that the label depends more on the overall message communicated, the sum of the techniques employed, and the source's motivations. Since Limbaugh does not hide his persuasive intent and often discusses opposing perspectives if only to ridicule them, Swain concludes that the label propagandist is not appropriate for him and similar talk hosts. At this point, it seems safe to assert that partisan talk shows are persuasive to their listeners. The audience comes willingly, finds ratification of its pre-existing attitudes, and is welcomed into a group of fellow believers. This group feels threatened by an outgroup that wants to take the possessions and freedoms they cherish, and at the center of the show community is a host who seems to share their concerns, reinforces their beliefs, provides them with new information, and frames it according to their attitudes. And best of all, he offers solutions to their fears and pains, and that solution is remarkably simple: fight against the outgroup. This may be especially salient among conservatives. Lakoff asserts that conservatives view the world through a strict father frame in which the head of the family is authoritarian, knows right and wrong, and is to be obeyed. If that's what conservatives look for, that could be what talk hosts are giving them. Once subjects have been persuaded, some authors assert that hosts use inoculation to decrease the chance that audiences will be unpersuaded by counterarguments. Inoculation is a well-studied technique in which subjects are made to feel that their beliefs are threatened by others who would challenge them, then are presented with a weakened version of the threatening argument. This both prepares the subject for the argument and shows them how to counter it. It's common in communications and marketing literature, and authors such as Jameson and Capella make passing mentions to it in Limbaugh. But to date, my own comprehensive search of literature yields no academic studies of methods of inoculation as applied to these shows. No matter whether these techniques are used to deliver conservative, liberal, or even commercial messages, it's important that audiences become aware of the techniques at work in these shows. Even granting that selection bias means audiences come to these shows willingly and in search of the messages they provide, it's not a given that they understand all the persuasive tools being applied to them, or that they would agree to persuasion if they were. The only defense against such influence, whether consented to or unrecognized by the audience, is understanding the intent of the message source, the foundation of the source's influence, and the techniques that the sources use to persuade and motivate audiences. Making audiences aware of persuasive techniques as a means of resisting them is another form of inoculation, and it has also been researched in the field of propaganda. Banas and Miller found that warning subjects they were about to see a video that contained false information about the 9/11 attacks reduced the video's persuasiveness. They also found that telling subjects that people might try to make them doubt the messages in the video reduced the effect of the inoculation. That is, they showed inoculation against inoculation. Understanding and creating awareness of these intense relationships and techniques is essential to inoculating the population against unrecognized and undesired persuasion and is a worthy topic for media psychology. Our field is uniquely qualified to lead this exploration due to our discipline's emphasis on the uses, gratifications, and influences of mediated messages on the audience in each of the following research areas. How do partisan political information sources influence and persuade audience members to accept and act upon political messages? And does education about the techniques employed mediate their persuasive power? Once again, this research has focused on over-the-air partisan talk radio in general, and Rush Limbaugh in particular. But the questions raised here are not limited to this one host or channel. They would seem to apply to any group that tunes to partisan media for information they agree with. This is significant because just as American conservatives embrace talk radio as an antidote to the liberal bias they see in mainstream media, many others turn to social media and the online world for similar reasons. There is a presumption in many sections of the populace that social media is a channel for peer interaction from the masses to the masses, rather than from the elites to the ordinary people. Rather than receiving communications through hierarchical leadership channels, individuals are seen to be talking between and among themselves, imbuing messages with a presumption of credibility based on the expected similarities between the source and the audience. But established elites are also moving into social media with the same messages that they put on the air, sometimes in their own names, sometimes not, giving sources of all kinds and intents the ability to share social media's inherent trustedness. Further, because of the anonymity and potential for deception built into social media, sources who may be viewed skeptically online, on the radio, or in other media can reconstruct themselves in social media guises that tap the audience's trust in the platform. Social media can thus be seen as a blade that cuts two ways. More voices can share more perspectives, but the authenticity and intent of those messages is even more unknowable. As the number of voices grows, so does the need for listeners to recognize persuasive intent so they can choose for themselves whether and how they are willing to be persuaded. So in summary, a need exists to understand the forms of persuasion used in partisan media. Radio shows provide a good research venue because of their longevity and popularity. Foundational data such as audience characteristics and host interactions are available. Some persuasion techniques are documented, such as the existence of propaganda appeals and in-group, out-group rivalries. Others, such as inoculation, have been hinted at, but apparently not studied academically. This research should be done to help ensure that audiences of all persuasive media can be aware of the techniques applied to them and have the opportunity to challenge their messages. Now let's open the floor to your questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, please return to the Zoom meeting now.
Pilot of the airwaves, here is my request. You don't have to play it, but I hope you'll do your best. I've been listening to your show on the radio, and you seem like a friend to me.